Jon Meacham recently wrote for Time magazine that a grasp of the past can be orienting as Americans navigate the turbulence of impeachment proceedings and the rise of populism, both here and abroad. And he wrote, it is hard to predict the way the current impeachment debate will end, noting that Andrew Johnson survived impeachment and Richard Nixon's support held until the very last moment of Watergate. But whatever happens, the start of the hearings marked the beginning of a test for the country. Joining me from Nashville is Jon Meacham. Jon, welcome.
Thanks, Bob.
Let's begin there. What stands out to you about how this president and this nation are handling that test?
Well, I think that we're having a basic argument in the country about what the facts are and what we should make of those facts. And that's a moment that has been bubbling along, forming, really for 50 years or so. But these are perennial forces. Walter Lippmann said 100 years ago, 1921, he wrote a book called Public Opinion, in which he defined the besetting problem of the modern age might be that we would define and then we would see instead of seeing and then defining. And it's only gotten worse in the ensuing 100 years. So I think we have to find two things, really. A common set of facts, and if we can agree on those, then there's a basic kind of democratic, lowercase d, health to that. And then we have an argument about what to make of those facts. My own sense is that we live on these two different planets, and the fate of the country may well hang, the fate of the Republican system may well hang on the people who are willing to admit that their minds have been changed. And part of the American Revolution, part of the reason we were able to undertake this experiment was the insight that the Enlightenment had created an era in human affairs where we could react to changing circumstances, we could change our opinions based on differing discernible realities as we were able to see them. And that insight, that reason had to take a stand against passion in the arena was very much, in some ways, the formative insight of the Constitution that's being tested anew right now.
Speaking of the Constitution, take us back to the Constitutional Convention when the founders came up with the idea of impeachment and included it. Why was it important then, and why does it matter now?
It fits into the checks and balances. The essential insight, James Madison was the clearest articulator of it, that divided sovereignty was essential because if you made any one branch, any one element in the compact too powerful, the interests of that sect would take over and run away with the system. They were aiming for a balance. They were aiming for the insight that we were all sinful, we were all driven by appetite and ambition, and therefore we had to divide authority, divide power in a way that would prevent any one element from knocking the whole system out of whack. And impeachment was one of the checks and balances on the executive and the judicial branches. It came out of the English common law. It's a 14th century idea, basically. The three things that were named in the Constitution, it's a very brief article, were treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And as Gerald Ford famously said in the 20th century, high crime and misdemeanor is whatever a majority of the House of Representatives decides it is at a given moment. But the essential element, the reason for having impeachment was, as George Mason said of Virginia, he asked, shall any man be above justice? And should that man who has the most extensive power to commit the most extensive injustice be above justice? And so there was this clear understanding that there had to be a fail-safe, to mix anachronistic metaphors. There had to be a final check on an executive or a judge who was violating the compact of divided sovereignty, respecting the rights of the other elements, the other contractors to the American compact.
You've written a stellar biography of Andrew Jackson. When you look at this current age, are we in another populist moment and the institutions and norms in this country being challenged by that populism?
We are in a populist moment. We're in a nationalist moment. The forces that are flowing right now are perennial American forces. Xenophobia, racism, nativism, isolationism, extremism. They ebb and they flow in American life. We have always been divided. We were divided Patriot versus Tory. We were divided North versus South. We were divided Jim Crow versus integration. And now we're divided in red versus blue. The key element and the way what history tells us about how we've gotten out of these moments is we have managed to understand that our best moments come when we more generously apply the implications of what was really the most important sentence ever originally rendered in English by Thomas Jefferson, that all men were created equal and were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And this is not a homily, it's not a Thanksgiving prayer. It's historically true. When we think about the eras that you will admit, one would admit they want to go back to, they are always eras where we have more widely opened our arms, not eras where we've closed doors. And populism does not have to be a disruptive force to the constitutional order. In this case, in many ways it is. President Trump is, I think, not Jacksonian in the sense that Jackson, for all of his faults, believed in the Union. He believed in that system, again, however flawed it was at the time. So for him, it was an end. For Jackson, populism and America was the consuming drama. For President Trump, the consuming drama is President Trump, and that's an essential difference.
What about the Republican Party? You've often spoken of the McCarthy years and Margaret Chase Smith, the late senator from Maine, and how she spoke up against Senator McCarthy. And we saw Senator Goldwater in the Nixon era go to the White House and confront President Nixon during Watergate. Where is the GOP today?
They are nowhere near the Barry Goldwater of 1974, and they aren't even within the same zip code as Margaret Chase Smith in 1950. Margaret Chase Smith, Republican of Maine, gave a speech very shortly after McCarthy's Lincoln's birthday address in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he launched his crusade. And she gave a statement called the Declaration of Conscience. She only got 6 Republicans to support her. McCarthy dismissed them as Snow White and the 6 Dwarves. And yet, 4 years later, that's where half the Republican caucus, 22 Republicans, voted to censure McCarthy in 1954. That's where they ended up. And we are here, and this is what I would say to the Republicans today, who have suspended in many cases their critical faculties in exchange for raw power. You know this very well. The reason Republicans are acting the way they're acting is they're seeing numbers that show Republicans in their state or their district not only support the president, but strongly support. That's the category that's so disorienting to them. The Republicans we talk about, the Democrats we talk about in a warm and venerable way, are the leaders who took a risk and actually told their base of support something that base of support didn't want to hear. Think about American presidents. What's the one thing we think when we think about Nixon and we think on the positive side? It's going to China. The old Cold Warrior, the guy who got Alger Hiss, opens up this vast communist nation. Lyndon Johnson, from a segregated state in Texas, does civil rights. Ronald Reagan, the Cold Warrior, ends the Cold War. We honor people, we honor presidents, and we honor lawmakers who tell us what we don't want to hear. And what I would urge Republicans to do is think about, what do you want us to think when we look at your portrait on the wall? And it has a small chance of working because no politician can imagine a world where we're not staring adoringly at their portrait. I think that has to be the test. It has to be not what's going to get you through the next couple of months, but what's going to get you viewed in history the way that you would want your family to view you and the way you would want history to talk about you.
Jon, we just have a few seconds left. You've written about America's soul, about its better angels. Do you remain an optimist here on this Thanksgiving week or not?
I am optimistic, if only because we've, as Wellington said of Waterloo, getting America this far was the damnedest close-run thing you ever saw in your life. And Winston Churchill's alleged to have said that you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing once they've exhausted every other possibility. We're in the midst of doing that, but I think that ultimately the 242-year experiment, the 55-year experiment since the Voting Rights Act, creating this polity, that's going to win.
Jon, we'll have to leave it there. I'll bring you back for a show on Churchill. I look forward to that. Thank you very much for joining us.